So what is logic? That is, what constitutes valid reasoning? You know, how do we know whether or not to trust someone's series of thoughts that they take for granted as having a relation, almost a domino-like automatic relation? I'm John Edward Willey, and this is about the fifth in a series of introductory monologues on the fundamental questions and concepts in philosophy. I say monologue, but it's more of an experimental eruption. That is, what I'm doing is, like many ways of doing philosophy are, pinned between mathematics and music. You know, many philosophers strive for a particular analytical rigor. That is, they tend towards the mathematical Pythagorean element of philosophy, or the Platonic element even. But Plato and Pythagoras both contain also the musical as a kind of tension within them that they sort of were satisfied with having resolved. But the musical element of philosophy, I think, will always be a part of what we're doing, insofar as, contrary to what a lot of even professional philosophers think, philosophy may have more in common with its strange cousin music and art than it does with science. You know, that very thought in itself is very disruptive to typical philosophical thinking. But what I'm wanting to do here is to investigate basic ideas in philosophy that have to be grasped and mastered to a degree that is frustrating and unnerving. And it also constitutes a never-ending process within philosophy, wherein one is always wrestling with the concepts that I've wrestled with so far in the last videos about skepticism, the concept of knowledge, the concept of truth, and now the question of logic. But on the other hand, this is not a channel specifically about philosophy. And although that's my favorite subject, this is a YouTube channel about life and poetry as well. And so the question about logic in regards to life is a vitally urgent question, because we are not thinking about logic itself or philosophy itself in the abstract. Each of us are living through the very ideas and concepts and beliefs and narratives that we allow ourselves to believe. And that, in many ways, is the very center within every one of us that helps the architecture of our cultural narratives keep moving forward based on the very things that we live through. You know, power is very real. And so, in the spirit of that, and in the spirit of doing what is also perhaps boring to so many people, because it almost goes without saying, you know, of course they know about logic, because everyone assumes that the way they think is logical. And in many ways, there is a particular biological way of understanding why that would be the case. But what I'm wanting to do is to think about how logic relates to life. That is, on the one hand, the question of logic has to do with the science of valid reasoning. You know, like, logic is very important because it has to do with learning how to get from one step to another in a way that is not only demonstratable, but also inferable. And so those are the very pillars of what is called symbolic logic, inference and demonstration. And that itself has become its own little mini project within the Western tradition, meaning that the pursuit of symbolic and so-called modal logic is an important part of the philosophy of mathematics, and much of it is about the very basis and foundation of mathematics. And so it's no coincidence that I brought up Pythagoras earlier, who is sort of the very beginning of many assumptions within philosophy itself that are not assumptions so much as basic ideas that one has to really grasp before one can even begin to challenge, you know. And what I mean by that is that we live in an age when logic itself is sort of seen as unnecessary, that, like, anyone's logic counts, that everyone has their own subjective experience and their own way of thinking that justifies almost any conclusion. But this to any clear-minded thinker is in many ways insufferable, even if one is a full-blooded pluralist, wanting all people to become whatever they are. You can see that the limitations that people placed upon themselves have to do with not seeing that they have beliefs about logic, that because they're not aware of having them, they can't challenge. And because they can't challenge, in many ways, they can't become more logical. That is, they can't benefit from a little bit of logical thinking, not about philosophy, but about their life. Logic in this sense has to do with real critical thinking, what is sometimes in my mind called creative theory, because what we're doing is attempting to think practically but creatively about the very options that each of us face in our particular situation. And so when we're thinking about life, we're not necessarily thinking about philosophy, but logic itself is universal. So what I'm trying to say is twofold. The two pillars within this entire thought are that, on the one hand, logic is inescapable. So what one is doing when one is learning about logic isn't learning a set of beliefs, but understanding what valid reasoning is. And so that's a fundamental thing to grasp within logic itself, which is that we're not talking about what is true or not true, because it doesn't have to do with beliefs. It's actually even more neutral than that, because logic itself has to do with the inferences that we make between our beliefs and whether or not those inferences are valid. And so it's also the most boring of all subjects, but the most immediate and existential of all subjects. And so when I say that there is an inescapability of logic, I'm bringing up this first pillar. But the second pillar is intelligibility and the question of the limits of intelligibility and logic. Because on the one hand, I am saying that there's something inescapable and something we cannot question about logic, but philosophers don't really do that. And so a part of what has to be seen is that a ruthless self-criticism about logic has to do with discovering the horizon of all human understanding. That is, seeing not intelligibility, that is what we can make sense of in the world, but seeing what is impossible to understand, and so therefore narrows the very possibility of what human understanding and knowledge can be. Now, that sounds very abstract and ethereal, but it's not. One of my favorite quotes comes from an old novel, and it has to do with the definition of a fishing net. The fishing net, by the character in the book, is a collection of holes held together with strings. A net is a collection of holes held together with strings. I think this is fundamental in understanding intelligibility, and what I mean is this: that human knowledge itself, epistemology, and the ways that we make it happen, especially in the way that we are influenced by our cognition, our biology, but also the ways that our cultural models, especially through Rene Descartes and Cartesian thinking, infuse within us a particular kind of net. And what I mean by a net or a fishing net, and the reason that I'm speaking about these holes, is because the very calculus that we use through which we filter reality is a calculus that is defined by the attempt to reduce everything to the lines in that map. So it is said that the territory is not the map, right? That's a saying that a lot of people have heard, that the territory is not the map. Another phrase for this is that it's called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. That's what Alfred Whitehead, the philosopher, called it, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Another phrase for this is reification, R-E-I-F-I-cation. Reification is making something real when it's not real. And so what we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about the very nets that we use in terms of what constitutes a belief, what constitutes knowledge and truth, and what constitutes warranting our attention, we have to pay attention to the degree to which the net is able to capture things that it's designed to capture, i.e. fish. So these ideas about logic are extraordinary nets for capturing what we need. But the net is much bigger than we realize. And water, in fact, is more like reality than the fish are. And so the question then is, what are our cognitive nets, especially when they're tightly wound, missing fundamentally? That is, what is it about reality that eludes intelligibility? Because I'm not a mystic, and I'm not making any kind of claim about mystical knowledge or about transcendence or anything like that. And I'm also not saying that we don't know anything as a species, that that knowledge is absent or anything like that. I do believe that we obviously have various forms of knowledge, and truth in itself is a very, very multifarious, open-ended kind of question. But in these videos, what I'm wanting to do is to sort of make clear the first part, the first pillar of what I'm saying, which is the inescapability of logic. That is, to reject logic is to use logic. That is what is meant by inescapability. That to reject the points about logic that I'm about to explain is to use or imply a kind of logic that one discovers after struggling against it to be so universal that one is, if one is still enduring, prone to simply observe with awe. And what I mean by this is that what we're talking about when we talk about logic is what a conceivable reality would look like. So when we're thinking about logic, we're remembering that we are wanting to be logic, that logical is inherently a good thing. And that's connected to the impossibility of denying logic without using logic, meaning that we think we're being logical when we do that. So then the question is, what are the principles that are monitoring our own rejection of logic? That is, philosophers are interested in this underlying examination of the concepts within the concepts. That's why I think of philosophy as being a particular kind of conceptual engineering, in that we are wanting to investigate the very concepts within these concepts that otherwise would render reality non-intelligible. So what is it that makes reality intelligible? And then that will ultimately lead to the question of non-intelligibility. But I don't mean to be so abstract or ethereal, because I do think that in regards to life, the ability to tell the difference between shit and Shinola is what logic is in its most basic form. The ability to tell shit from Shinola, that is, to tell fact from fiction, to tell truth from falsehood. One of the more startling things about human existence and the human past has happened in a series of stages. And the first has to do with the cognitive revolutions that occurred within our species somewhere between 30,000 and 70,000 years ago. Because the effect of this cognitive revolution was twofold. On the one hand, it had to do with the production of culture, that is, the exteriorization of cognition. That is, language and beliefs and imaginative ideas that we all believe to be real, so much so that they actually become real and then run our lives. This is primarily the very power that the cognitive revolution allowed, because it gave us a way of mapping our reality. I showed my notes. It gave us a way of organizing ourselves in an extremely powerful way. That is, thinking merely in terms of symbols collectively allowed us to begin doing things that make us what we are. And so it's interesting that by the time Plato and Aristotle emerge, way after the emergence of symbolic thinking and the cognitive revolutions, they're already dealing with problems that are as old to them as they are to us, And by problems, I don't mean like particular personal problems, but the very questions as to what constitutes truth and falsehood. Because when you step back and think about the human brain, right? So much of our brain, so many of the calories that we consume and so much of our brain power goes into not intelligible thinking, but a particular kind of what is called emotional intelligence. That is, a significant part of our brain has evolved in relation to groups of others through which we were constantly playing different games. Not games in the silly sense of it just being a game like a child's game, but the very games that constitute the human social world, the whole of the social world. These particular games are the very basis of what we think of as logic, because after the question of survival, and after some basic questions that humans face, the very basic question, perhaps even preceding these, is telling whether or not another person is telling the truth. Being able to detect falsehood in other people is sort of like the basis of the evolution of logic. And I think that's why it's something that is not philosophical, but has to do with life itself. Meaning that when we're trying to tell shit from Shinola, what we're trying to do is to operate on an intuitive level. And this intuitive logical level is really, really overlooked. And when I bring up the limits of intelligibility, what I think is ultimately, in fact, an open-ended, huge gap between knowledge in the human world, especially what would constitute something like certain knowledge, we see that we in fact know far less than we think we know when we're being optimistic about the human project and human knowledge. In fact, what we don't know so far exceeds our ability to even conceive of it, that we just poured it out of our minds. And so logic becomes a precious thing, because logic is an instrument. It's a carnal, physical thing. It's not a transcendental or transcendent operation. It's not rationality with a capital R. It's a careful, kind of delicate, open-ended, experimental thinking. And not only that, but there's ways in which art itself has a kind of logic, that the logic of irony and narrative thinking is often a different kind of logic than symbolic logic or semiotic logic. And so grasping these different so-called modalities is a rich part of philosophical thinking, just as much as symbolic logic and mathematical logic is fascinating in its own way. But what's called having horse sense, having horse sense in the sense of sensus communis, common sense, that in itself is an intuitive way of understanding or detecting truth and falsehood, which can never be overlooked, given that it is a very part of our creaturely selves. And it's almost removed from the part of ourselves that thinks of itself as being in control. So we think of ourselves almost as needing to be logical, as if we have to have a kind of understanding. But beneath all of this, there's another kind of order that's just sort of working its way through us. And it's not that we don't have to think logically and think clearly, but we often overestimate the degree to which what counts as symbolic logic has something to do with our particular individual lives. What it actually has to do with is the development of a neoliberal framework, not just a neoliberal framework, but the very basis of Boolean algebra that's sort of at the basis of all computers, all computer systems. Computing itself emerges from the philosophy of mathematics. It emerges from this inward, eccentric investigation of logic itself. And ironically, we are unable to really find foundations itself within logic, just as much as we're unable to find the kind of certainty and foundations within mathematics as many people would take for granted as us having. This is another example of the non-intelligibility, And so rather than speaking even analytically or clearly here, I'm really leaping around, because a part of my modus operandi is to not only be a musician in the life of the mind, but to be a mix master, That is to be like a sort of DJ, in the world of ideas, to be a mix master in the life of the mind, you know? And so I'm really working and weaving my way through these various elements rather than being specifically analytical about them like so many others are. And that has something to do, in fact, with the much messier, much more chaotic nature of human logic. And it will always elude those who are attempting to pin it down. But there are some things that can be pinned down that are inescapable. And you know, on the most basic level, in terms of what Plato and Aristotle did with logic, it has to do with making clear what is really the revolutionary effect of Plato and Aristotle, which is this: the most basic idea, that is the most radical idea, is that we are rational creatures and that the world is rational and that there's a relation between these. And that relation is the logos. And the logos, of course, is related to the word logic, but logos is also related to the word. And in many ways, logos means the emergence of intelligibility. And it has much more to do with the very mysterious way that our understanding simply emerges into the world, rather than being something that we really have a clear insight into or that we can see. It emerges in the works of the ancient philosopher Heraclitus as being something like the rationality of the world. But in Plato and Aristotle, this becomes not only the basis of philosophical logic itself, but the basis of symbolic logic. And this is what's most commonly associated with Socrates, with Socratic logic. And that has to do with what is called universal instantiation. And universal instantiation is just a really fancy way of saying that if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. That in itself is something that is so obvious that it goes without saying, but it has to be said insofar as it's that very basis that makes our world intelligible. It's what makes our world conceivable, the very basis of conception itself, i.e. the very basis that we can even understand the world. Because one has to remember that this is always challenged by people, and this is always challenged by experience. Like, can we in fact have a rational relation to the world? I don't take that for granted, especially because I don't think of us as minds or beings so much as brains and bodies, you know? And so logic itself, as I mentioned earlier, is a slightly tenuous thing. But the other principle that is the basis of symbolic logic, and this is as much as I'm really going to go into this, I just want to point it out as being a part of what philosophy is, because a part of what philosophy is sort of like drawing and art. A lot of what drawing and art is learning the fundamentals of visual sight, learning the fundamentals of aesthetics, which is sort of like learning the basics of perceptual thinking with the hands, learning how to make hand-eye contact. In drawing, that is crucial, and it's a perennial activity of all artists, no matter what field they're in. And I think that logic and knowledge and truth in many ways are like that, and that is precisely what we're doing when we're attempting to get clear about such things as universal instantiation, meaning that if we're thinking about what logic is, it has to do with valid inferences, and the very basis of a valid inference has to do with the connections that we're making between one thing and another. And so this basic idea must be true if we are to speak at all. So if anything at all is to make sense or to be rational, this must be the case. And believe it or not, this is challenged in all kinds of different traditions. And to this day, there's millions and millions of people who reject these principles and these ideas. The other idea, besides universal instantiation, is what's called existential generalization. And it's another like seemingly boring, like just really bland idea. But it means that if something is true of all things, then it is true of the one particular thing, or that there's a relationship between the general and the specific, so that if there is true about something in particular, then it's containing things that are true about it specifically. And this very principle sort of forms the basis of logical thinking, valid reasoning in philosophy, in the way that seeing what negative space is in the visual art world is, and being able to think conceptually as a conceptual engineer. One, in many ways, is having to see that one is working with these pieces. And these are the most abstract, but I'm sort of elucidating how abstract symbolic logic can be, because it is its own field. And in many ways, when modern philosophers talk about logic, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about these extraordinarily nuanced investigations of ideas that are so basic that we take for granted, but they're often challenged, like especially in the legal system or, the political world, given that we say that they're arguing about semantics as having a negative connotation. But many meaningful things are, in fact, an investigation or an examination of semantics, because language itself is an evolving thing as much as we're evolving. And so semantics is a part of what in last videos I've called the hermeneutic circle, which is the investigation of things that change as much as we change. And so there's really not as much of a solid ground as we think there is. And these principles are crucial and form what is probably, to anyone listening, an abstract version of logic. But three of the more fundamental principles in logic that are vital have to do with things that are, once they're explained, are so obvious that they seem to warrant no explanation. But as I keep reiterating, philosophy is precisely that re-examination without self-satisfaction of those fundamentals. And so we have the law of non-contradiction, we have the law of excluded middle, and the law of identity. And that last one, of course, is the most fundamental, the law of identity, which in logic means that something is what it is and not something else at the same time. This is what is called a tautology, and is sometimes associated with Gottfried Leibniz, the German philosopher. But that's not precisely the same thing as seeing that what is being said is that reality is one thing and not another thing. Or more specifically, that something is what it is and not something else at the same time and in the same place, if that makes sense. There's another related rule, which is the law of excluded middle. And that means that something cannot both be something and be something else at the same time. And obviously it's related to, and in many ways rooted in, the first rule about identity. But the law of excluded middle, to me, is more particular and more fascinating because it has to do with the sort of rejection of two worlds, of the idea that there are two worlds. Because one underlying feature of the philosophical mind is that if there even is such a thing as metaphysical idealism or solipsism, it still constitutes one world. And that one feature of logic that separates Western philosophy from other forms of thinking is this law of excluded middle. And that's why in detecting the degree to which one is rooted in the more common Western philosophical traditions, one can ask them to what degree they believe in one world or two worlds, because it's not as if believing in two worlds separated the people who believe in one world, but even the people who believe in two worlds still believe in one world in the Western philosophical tradition, because they still assume that there's a logical relationship between these worlds, and that logical relationship forms a particular kind of sameness that sort of even Descartes could not overcome. And the law of non-contradiction is the other. And that is the basis of symbolic logic itself, as being another thing that is mirrored and wedded to the first two, but distinct in its own right, and so obvious that one cannot violate it, that it almost seems to go without arguing. But it is rejected again and again in all kinds of metaphysical tendencies, not that are philosophical metaphysical tendencies, but the kinds that are associated with delusion and with the separation from clear thinking. And so I think that leads me to an interesting question about logic, because what is it that's being insisted upon? It doesn't seem as if anything has been said that really would be rejected by anyone in particular. And I think that's certainly the case, because what we're largely discussing when we talk about logic in that way has to do with a particular kind of deductive logic with a D, which is a much more abstract, in many ways idealized version of what valid thinking and therefore valid living would even mean. And when we look at life itself, or when we begin with ways of thinking that had to do with thinking of ourselves as brains and as bodies, we discover that logic is not operating from a set of certain principles. Because although it is the case that ipso facto, through universal instantiation and existential generalization and all the other things that I've said, that there's a kind of comfort that comes with them and a kind of certainty, especially when we see that it does produce power, it does produce things. But our lives themselves, in an existential way, are inductive. And it's through inductive reasoning that we make sense of the world. Not to suggest that there isn't deductive thinking, as I had just said, but that it's through induction, that is through a much more physical, much more sort of experimental, open-ended relationship to our world, that we in fact thrive. And logic in that sense has to do with a kind of testing. It has to do with a kind of feeling out, we make sense of the world in this way. I brought up earlier the ways that intuitively we have a kind of logical understanding that we often struggle to put into analytical terms. But in the same way, so much of what makes our lives beautiful has to do with a kind of vulnerability, has to do with a kind of logic which is much more elusive and much more sort of out of step even with the ideas that we have about what our lives are, logically speaking. And yet I have to be careful, because even in speaking in that way, I'm sort of attempting to do what I'm saying is impossible, which is to make sense of what can't be made sense of. And the reason that I brought up that quote earlier about a net, meaning our knowledge, our intelligibility, being made up of a bunch of holes held together with strings, what I mean to say is that those strings are logic. And there's a reason that we have a net, because we have to have knowledge. There's a way in which knowledge is fundamental to having any kind of control or any kind of power over our lives. That's precisely what is at the heart of logic, is a powerful thing, is a kind of tool that is fragile but powerful within us. But when one is really seeing how much we don't know that we often think we do, and that is our positivistic conceptions of human knowledge, as if we were building knowledge over time and that we were growing in truth, that is utterly inaccurate. It's not that we don't know anything, but that the problem is sometimes called the problem of emergent properties. And the problem of emergent properties has a lot to do with the relationship between disciplines that we often take for granted, which is the relationships between chemistry and physics and biology. We sort of assume that reality is layered with physics and then biology, or physics and then chemistry is sort of laid onto physics, and then biology is laid onto chemistry. And the problem is that these assumptions don't allow us to really pay attention to the gaps between these disciplines, that is, the gaps within which we live our lives. And that is even history, like history as a thing is so separate from biology, and biology itself is so separate from aesthetic thinking, art thinking. And so what we can assume to be a universal foundation of thinking, which is logic, we often find spirals out into 100 million different strange forms, being that what we intuit to be logic takes on so many different forms, and yet there is in fact something inescapable about it. And there's something absolutely vital, not just in the abstract metaphysical way, but something critically vital about a person being able to tell when somebody is lying to them, like telling shit from Shinola, like being logical, you know? And I think that's the way to think about it, and then to work backwards as us as brains and bodies, as people, and to think about what philosophy would mean from that point of view, from a carnal point of view. What is rationality if it doesn't have a capital R? Not that there's no rationality, just like truth without a capital T. Not that we don't have truth, not that we don't have a path towards the rational, a path towards intelligibility. I think that's the horizon that disappears as we approach the path to intelligibility, but it's a path that we are sort of born into. And of course, you know, when you're speaking to yourself like I am, you're bound to say certain silly things like that. But there's so much that I have also left unsaid, you know? But I guess that's why this is precisely a introductory video about logic and its inescapability and the limits of intelligibility. I'm John Edward Willie, and I love doing this. This is like the greatest experience that I have, simply doing what I do best, but doing it performatively, bringing philosophy to life. You know, that's why I see myself as like a DJ in the life of the mind. Like I see myself as like a postmodern mix master, because I'm not even a person. Like all of this is just coming through me like I'm a faucet. You know, I just turn myself on. Like Donna Summer said, I'm a radio, you know, turn me on. And I imagine like listeners having an experience. Like these are not just simply a set of beliefs, or I'm not simply explicating or explaining philosophy. I'm dancing for you all, you know, I'm your little dancing boy. So I love you guys. Have a good night.